Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Hello and welcome. I'm Alison Stewart, the CEO of FAR, and I'm your host for the Cut the Crop series. Now today we're talking about weed management and herbicide resistance, and it's really an episode of two parts. The first component is an interview that we did with an overseas researcher from Oregon State University, Carol Mallory-Smith, and she visited FAR over the summer period and was one of our presenters at our area field day. And she talked about the work that has been going on in the United States with respect to managing weeds and, more importantly, managing the resistance problems that they've been having with a number of their key weed species. The second component is a discussion with one of the FAR researchers, Matilda Gunnarsson, who oversees all of our weed management and herbicide resistance activities. So let's start off with hearing from Carol, who's talking to Anna Heslop.
I guess the first really important question is defining exactly what herbicide resistance is.
So herbicide resistance is, very simply put, herbicide used to be effective on a particular weed species and now it isn't. Along with that comes the scientific basis of it there's a mutation in a particular individual in that population that carries a trait that doesn't let it be controlled by the herbicide anymore.
So that mutation is just naturally occurring?
Yes. If you have a large population of plants in a paddock, you would expect that maybe some individuals in there might carry a mutation that would allow it to survive that herbicide application.
So there's lots of different terminology used in this business. What's the difference between tolerance and resistance?
So tolerance is the ability to control one species and not the other, and that's why we can apply herbicides to a crop, and it's not going to injure the crop, but you do control the weed, so that's really tolerance within the crop. We also can have tolerance in weeds. For example, there could be a grass species, if you apply a herbicide like 2,4-D to it, that's not going to be controlled. So the terms are different in that you wouldn't expect the weed to be controlled by that particular herbicide.
And as opposed to resistance, is there more than one type of resistance?
There are many types of resistance, unfortunately. There's target site resistance, which is really the simplest, where you have just a very simple mutation and the herbicide doesn't actually go to the location or have the effect that it's supposed to in the plant. We also have non-target site resistance, which is more complicated. We have less understanding of that. Where the herbicide is probably going to be either broken down in the plant or it will be not translocated like it should be in the plant.
We're hearing more and more about some weeds that are resistant to a number of different herbicides.
Yes, and that's really the increasing problem. We can have cross resistance, which is just resistance to two herbicides that would be in the same group. For example, in group A, you might have resistance to two different herbicides in that group, and that's one kind of resistance. Then we have multiple resistance, where you could have resistance to herbicides in different groups. So, for example, in group A and group B, in one individual would be resistant to both of those groups of herbicides. Can be even way more complicated than that, where you could have resistance in some plants. We found resistance to 6 different groups of the herbicides. So it can become very complicated for control.
So how has this actually come about? How have we got here?
We got here because herbicides are effective. They are actually very easy to use. They've been inexpensive for growers to use. And so that's led to their continued use. We use them in almost every cropping system, in almost every crop that we grow. And just having the exposure of those populations, as we were talking about, exposed to those herbicides over and over again, you can find that individual out there that's going to be resistant to that herbicide. And so now you've selected a plant that will reproduce, produce seeds out there, and pretty soon you have a population in that field.
Now, you've been in New Zealand for a couple of weeks. We're in December, at the nearly Christmas time, 2019. What have you seen around herbicide resistance in that time?
It's been quite interesting in that I think there's a difference in levels of awareness among growers. I met with one group of growers where one of the growers was dealing with resistance on his farm and had very, very aggressively addressed the problem. And it was interesting to talk with him about the changes that he had made on his farm and the awareness that he had of the problem. In other cases, growers I think they're aware of the problem, but if it hasn't been a problem on their farm, they're not quite as interested in it, or maybe thinking about how they would address it, or in preventing it or delaying it on their farms.
So what's your understanding of the levels of resistance in New Zealand at the moment?
Okay, so there's been resistance in New Zealand for a long time. And it's more isolated cases of it in particular cropping systems. So it hasn't been a really widespread problem, probably, for all growers to be dealing with a particular species. Now, however, and part of this is due to some of the surveys that have been done, more populations have been found that have resistance or maybe have multiple resistance. So I think that there's still probably a growing awareness of it. And as some of these surveys continue, I think the levels and the number of populations that are found to be resistant will increase.
So this is a warning sign?
I think this is a big warning sign from my experience coming from Oregon, where we have quite a bit of widespread resistance, multiple resistance, and that there's that should serve as a warning for, I think, other areas which have similar cropping systems, which there are similarities between our cropping systems, that growers should be really thinking about what they would do if they lose these tools in their system.
So what differences or similarities are there between what's happening here in New Zealand and what you're seeing at home in Oregon?
I think the similarities are definitely there. Because their cropping systems are very similar and many of the crops we grow are similar. Perhaps there's been more pressure on herbicides in our system to get the resistance that we have. Part of that comes back to just cropping practices with rotations, and most of our farms do not have animals, so we don't have that kind of mixed cropping that systems that are here. We don't have some of the pastures that are here. So there's some differences in how the crops would have been handled. So there may be some less resistance here. But as more pressure is put on those herbicides, then I would expect that you're going to see more complicated resistances to occur here too.
So if a farmer is a bit worried that a chemical application doesn't seem to have worked, how do they know they have a resistance problem or something just hasn't gone right?
Well, they won't know by looking at the plants because they all look the same, and we always wish that we had little R's on the plants out there that are resistant so we would know. But what they do need to be aware of is looking at what they're spraying, knowing what the weeds are out there before they've sprayed, and then going back after they've sprayed and observing what happened. If there's a particular species out there that didn't get controlled, they should all of a sudden start asking questions about that. And was there an application problem, which happens frequently, and maybe that's what's responsible for it. But they should also be looking at it with a more critical eye and thinking about what they're seeing in the field. And it's always then important to find out if you do have resistance. And obviously the FAR or other ag research would be people that you would contact about that, or even your field consultants, advisors would be people that you could bring it to their attention. Then getting it confirmed would be important, but beyond that, don't letting it go to seed. So don't sit back and say, oh, that's interesting, I wonder why it didn't get controlled, but go ahead and take care of that plant while you can.
So how would you do that?
I don't care how you do it. So a farmer has different options that he might be or she might be willing to use, but you could either mow it, you could go out and pull them, you could actually till it if you needed to, spot spraying, so anything that you need to just to prevent seed production.
So that's dealing with potentially resistance once it's happened. Mm-hmm. How about going back a step? What can growers be doing to slow the emergence of resistance in the first place?
Thinking about all the options that they have on their farms. So the overuse of a particular group of herbicides, for example, group A or group B, either one, if you use that in every crop that you have in your rotation, you're putting extra pressure out there to select for those individuals that will be resistant. So thinking about how you can mix up what you're doing out there. If still thinking about cultivation, if you have cultivation in your system, I think those are the main things that you'd really be thinking about, the diversity that you can keep out there in your actual management practices. We've moved from tillage into some more no tillage systems, so that creates other issues because you're going to be dependent upon herbicides, so you always have this sort of trade-off out there. But really being aware of what you've done year after year and trying to sort of put a break in that.
So what about waiting for the next big thing?
I wouldn't wait for the next big thing because we haven't had a next big thing for 25 years. So that's a very slow solution to this problem. Yes, we may get a new herbicide in the next decade, but I wouldn't count on that to solve the problem because even if we do happen to get a new herbicide, it may not work on that weed that you have resistance to. So that's a pretty big risk to think about you're going to have that solution.
So in your travels around New Zealand, what have you seen that has perhaps run up those red flags, and what have you seen that makes you think maybe it'll be okay?
I think what I've observed is the resistance is less complicated and probably less widespread than it could be. Part of that goes back to what I was talking about with your cropping systems, having some of those longer term pastures in them, still having animals in them, having multiple crops that can be grown. So some of those things I think are really important in this. And then having growers start to ask more questions about it and being concerned because they also realize that they don't have other options. And that's, most growers understand that because they're dealing with the limited number of control methods that they have.
Okay, so if you had one message for New Zealand growers about what not to do, and one message of what they should do, what would they be?
Well, they're pretty much the same message. Is not to continually use a herbicide from the same group. So be thinking about using herbicides from different groups, but also keeping in the back of their mind, do you have something else you can change in your system? Can I put cultivation in at a certain point in time that's not going to disrupt my cropping system? Are there ways of maybe rotating the crops so that a different herbicide could be used in a different crop? And I think the main message of what I would really have them think about is, on your own farm, with the weed problems you have, what is the one herbicide or two herbicides that you absolutely would not want to have become non-effective or to lose the option to use those for control of a specific weed species? And to think about then, what else could I do in my system to actually preserve those 2 or 3 herbicides?
And that's going to be different for every different farm?
Every farm is different. Every farm has different systems. Every farm may have a different way that they rotate their crops. They may have different times that they plant, and that may give them an advantage somehow or another. Every farm obviously has different enterprise and resources to put into weed control or weed management, and weed management is a small portion actually of a crop production. So growers will be thinking about, how does this fit in my whole system?
So we've just heard from Carol, and she's been telling us about how important it is to look after those herbicides that are still efficacious. So let's now bring in Matilda from FAR, Matilda Gunnarsson. Welcome, Matilda.
Thank you.
And find out what's been happening in New Zealand. So where do we sit, Matilda, with respect to how well are we managing weeds, and have we got the same problems as overseas with respect to resistance building up?
Yeah, so I think think we're in a pretty good position. We can grow a wide range of crops, which means that we can rotate those herbicides between our crops. A lot of farmers also have stock still in the system, pastures, which is all good things, but we should by no means think that we don't have resistance in New Zealand. There's about 20 species that are resistant to some type of herbicide already, and the first one was discovered already in the 70s, and we keep adding to that pool. But if we look worldwide, yes, we don't have as many as some, but yeah, we shouldn't think that it can't happen and it can't develop on our farms.
So which sort of herbicides have we got resistance? What are the top priority risks that we've got?
So considering that we are a major ryegrass seed producer, the group A and B herbicides are a great concern because that's what we have resistant to when it comes to ryegrass. So if we look at data worldwide when it comes to, again, just there's about 260 species that are resistant to some type of herbicide, and 160 of those sits in the group B. So that's quite major, and then followed is Group C. But I think for us, Group A and B is probably the greatest concern when we think of arable systems. This year, actually, we have 4 different trials that we're looking at grass control in cereals. And the main focus is to try and go away from those Group A and B herbicides. So we're looking at different options, different groups, also some herbicides that are new to New Zealand, but also things that are not commonly used in the cereal system.
So would we be a relatively heavy user of herbicides?
Probably. There is other tools to be used, and we should try and incorporate those tools where we can. Like if we can fit some kind of mechanical control in our rotation, that is a really good thing to do. It's also a good thing to think about is if you do have herbicides that you need for a particular crop, you should try and only use them in those crops and not continually use the same thing.
Because one of the issues, isn't it, that worldwide, there are relatively few really active herbicides now available, and there's very few new active ingredients coming through, the development process. So if we don't look after the herbicides that we've got and really learn how to manage them to mitigate that resistance build-up, then we're going to be in a situation where we potentially could lose our ability to effectively manage weeds.
Absolutely, and that's the thing. Like when we lose a herbicide, our toolbox gets smaller, which means that the risk of developing resistance to those other herbicides is greater. So that's why we need to look after them so we can use them for a long period of time, and also try and incorporate other weed control options where we can.
So we are actively going out and surveying, are we, for resistance to herbicides?
Yes, we are. So FAR is part of a large MBIE-funded program that is led by AgResearch, and FAR's role has been to go out and do weed surveys. So we have done 2 now, and the first one was in the Selborne district. So we went out just before harvest and collected. We were focusing on brome, ryegrass, and wild oat seeds. So went out, collected those seeds on 48 different farms, and sent it away for testing. And we almost 20% of the farms had some type of resistance. So it is definitely out there.
Do you think that there is a good awareness amongst growers about how best to manage sort of the risk of resistance, or is there still a lot of awareness and education that needs to be done?
There's probably a bit of both, but I think I think we're getting better at discussing it. I think it has sort of been a topic that farmers hasn't really wanted to. You don't really want to put your hand up and say, I have resistance on my farm, but I think we're getting closer to that, and people are talking more openly about it, which is a great thing, because that's how we learn from each other, and knowing that that you're not the only one, and then you can ask someone else how they managed the problem. And so, yeah, I think we're getting there.
So I know that we did last year indicate that we believed that we had picked up some resistance in ryegrass to glyphosate. Tell us a little bit about that story, because it's got a number of good lessons that we can learn from that.
Yeah, no, it does. So that was part of the survey from the Southern District that I mentioned. And the 48 farms, 11 of them had group A and B resistance, and that was not a surprise to us. We do know that it's out there. But also 9 of the farms had glyphosate-resistant survivors. So what happened then was we started communicating that with the growers, because it was a major thing, because it hadn't been found before. So we wanted to communicate with them straight away so they could do something about it. What is common to do when you test for resistance is to do a dose response test. So their first initial test was just testing all the plants for label rate. But then the plants were tilled up and repotted and then tested for how high of a rate of the herbicide they could survive. And in that second test, all the glyphosate plants died. So then we had 2 tests, one that said we had resistant plants and one said that we could fully control them. So what happened then was that went back and looked at what happened in the first experiment that didn't happen in the second one and tried to figure out what was going on. And what they found was a spike in temperature in the glass house of the first day of testing. And we did know that in Australia they'd found a specific type of glyphosate resistance that is temperature dependent. So that means that the plants can be controlled during under cooler temperatures, but at higher temperatures they're highly resistant. So then we had sort of thinking, well, this is probably what we have found then. But obviously we had to do more testing to be able to actually be sure. So then a third test was carried out, and the plants were purposely exposed to different temperatures. And again, we had no survivors. So now we had 2 tests that were saying one thing and 1 test that were saying another. So then a 4th experiment was carried out to just absolutely be sure what was going on. And again, we had no survivors. So we can now be very sure that we didn't find any glyphosate resistance in that survey.
Yeah. But I guess it's one of those things that's probably better to err on the cautious side when you first get an early result that suggests that something is positive.
Absolutely. And that's why we communicated it straight away. I mean, usually in research, that's why you repeat your experiment to be absolutely sure. But in this instance, we thought that they really needed to know so they could do something about it. And I do think positive things did come out of it. We have more openly talked about resistance. We have also talked more about glyphosate's efficacy and how and when the product should be used. And I think that is something we probably wouldn't have done if this didn't come up. So yeah.
So this MB program, it's how many years does it run for, and how long have we still got?
So it runs for 5 years. And I guess we're in the 2nd year now. Yeah. So, I mean, and there's a lot of work going on within the project, and there's a lot of stakeholders in it. And some people are doing more type modeling work, and our role is obviously the surveys, but we're also doing field trials and looking at different options. And we have had a integrated weed strategy that will come out soon, that are in the pipeline, and that's just part of that project too.
So what is the, how are you going to get this information from the programme out to the growers? Is there going to be a major sort of extension programme associated with the research?
I mean, for our work, I guess it goes out through our channels to reach the growers, and yeah, for us, we are probably the stakeholder that has the closest contact with the growers. So, but there's social scientists involved in the program, and there's universities, and so everyone, I guess, has their way of communicating as well. But I think FAR will be a major.
And it's such an important sort of challenge for growers managing herbicide resistance. So I guess it's watch this space and fingers crossed that there'll be some really useful results coming out of the programme. Excellent. Thank you very much, Matilda.
Thank you.
And thank you, listeners, and have a great day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.